right. So, so I don't know. I'm thinking it might take us 4 weeks to get through longitudinal models. So we'll see. We'll see when we get there. So, oh. So let's talk about time varying covariates. So remember, in our level 1 model, for a longitudinal model, we have time, right? So we're in our sort of as a level 1 predictor, right? Talked about a lot of different ways that it could be. But now we can also have, we mentioned this briefly, I think a couple weeks ago, but we can also have other variables that vary within person across time, right? And generally, I mean, they vary across time. And generally speaking, our time varying covariates are going to vary within person across time. So this could be things, again, we talked about this a little bit a couple weeks ago, but these could be things like, maybe you're looking at people's, let me think about what our examples are. Okay, so for our first example, actually, we're going to be using this data set that looks at people who looks at depression scores. Depression is actually our outcome variable, and it's a group of people who lost their jobs, so they're sort of all they end up entering the study because they show up at the unemployment office, and sort of it's this longitudinal study looking at depression across time for this group of people. But some people get jobs and some people don't get jobs. And of course, you could imagine actually that this isn't, you could get a job and then you could lose a job. Like you could not have a job and then get a job and then lose the job and get another job and lose a job. So you could imagine that that variable of whether or not you're employed could be a time varying covariate. Now, it's a dichotomous time varying covariate, right? Which is fine. Time varying covariates don't have to be continuous. So in this particular example, we're thinking about a dichotomous time varying covariate, whether or not a person is employed at the given time period where the depression score is being measured, right? So that's an example of a time varying covariate. It could be, I think in the homework that you're going to do, there are a couple of time varying covariates. The outcome variable is GPA. So it's GPA across like the first 6 semesters in college. And there are 2 time varying covariates in, I think, if I remember correctly. Yeah, I know there are 2. The first is study hours, how many hours a week you engage in studying in a given semester. And the second is whether or not you have a job actually during that semester. So, and whether or not you have a job is dichotomous, number of study hours is obviously continuous. So, I mean, there are lots of possibilities for what could be, time varying covariates. But again, these are things that are going to vary, across time within person. And as I mentioned, I think earlier, we also, we want these to vary, right? I mean, just because you measure something across time doesn't necessarily mean that there's a lot of variability. I mean, technically, if there's any variability, you can model it as a time varying covariate, but it certainly makes for a better time varying covariate if there's a decent amount of variability within person. But I guess I should pause and say that it's okay. There might not be any variability for some people. So for example, let's take the example of the unemployment example where we have people who, everybody maybe starts off unemployed, but even by the first data collection point, some people may have already gotten a job. So like they enter the study because they were at the unemployment office, but there's this whole IRB process and everything. And so by the time you actually get the first data point, some people may already have a job and they may be employed for the entire time period, right? So for those people, there is no within-person variability, and there could also be other people in that sample who didn't have a job for the entire time period, right? The entire data collection period, they don't have a job, they still don't have a job, they still don't have a job, and they still don't have a job, right? So that's okay. If some people, there's no variability within person for some people, that's okay. But obviously, if there's no within-person variability for, most people or if there's no within-person variability for any people, then obviously it can't be a time-varying covariate. So, what's that? What's the cutoff point? I mean, there isn't any kind of strict cut point. But if you think about it, for people for whom there isn't any within-person variability, you can't actually estimate a slope, right? Because remember how this works, right? So we've got this time-varying covariate, and we're saying that it randomly varies across people. So here we go. We've got sort of this pi sub 2i is a function of sort of this average, the average effect across all people, or the intercept, really what's called the intercept of that effect, plus this random, this between person, right? This between person residual. So there's some intercept of the overall effect, and then there's how much, person I deviates from that intercept. Well, if you think about it, like really actually estimate a within-person slope for someone who does not actually vary on that variable across time, right? Because how would you fit a slope? Because what you're saying is like, what's the effect of, changing on this one variable on this outcome? And if there's no change on the one variable for this person, then there's no way for that person to actually have a slope. So, if a quarter of the people in your sample don't vary on this time varying covariate, again, it can be a time varying covariate, but for those people for whom there is no variability, there's really no way to estimate a slope for those people. So that can then affect power, right? That can sort of affect the ability to allow for a random effect for that time varying covariate. So, you can have a situation where you have a time varying covariate, but you don't actually estimate a random effect for that time varying covariate. So, and in fact, that's what we're going to do with our first example. When we look at whether or not you have a job, I think in that example, I don't believe we're estimating a random effect for the time varying covariate for job or no job. But what does that mean if I don't estimate a random effect then? What am I really, like, what am I saying? Well, this is the effect of the time varying covariate on the outcome variable, right? If I don't have an R sub 2i, what does that mean? What am I saying about how that effect operates across people? Exactly. If I don't have this random effect, then I am still estimating, I'm still saying there is some effect of this within person variable, right? That like having a job or not, whatever, being employed or unemployed has an effect on, depression. But I'm saying whatever that effect is, it doesn't vary across people. So I'm saying, like, I'm just going to estimate this parameter estimate for this, beta 2 naught, right, is going to be this parameter estimate for the effect of the time varying covariate, but the effect of the time varying covariate doesn't vary across people. That's what it means if I don't put in this R sub 2i. Okay. So now, if I do have this, right, if I do have a model where I have this, then I'm saying the effect of the time varying covariate does vary across people. So thinking about our example about being employed or unemployed and the effect on depression, if I do allow for the effect of the time varying covariate to vary across people, then I'm saying like maybe being unemployed makes some people more depressed than other people, right? Or, the idea of like study hours on GPA. Maybe, for some people, studying more has a bigger impact, right? The amount of time that you study, the relationship between study hours and GPA might be stronger for some people than for other people. So that study hours slope is different for different people. Does that make sense? Or some, maybe some people are more susceptible. One of the examples that we'll do later is actually about our outcome variable is antisocial attitudes, and the time-varying covariate is exposure to antisocial peers. So it's like a sort of a peer pressure, peer influence independent variable. So like how rough is the peer group you're hanging out with? Like what's that exposure level to, sort of peers? And then how does that influence your, this is for teenagers antisocial attitudes. And again, you could, I like to think of that effect of the time-varying covariate as like a susceptibility parameter. Are some people more susceptible to peer influences than other people, right? So that's the idea. So if we have this piece here, then we're saying that the slope, that the effect of the time-varying covariate on the outcome variable, it varies across people. Does that make sense? Okay, which is cool. I mean, and if you think about it, that makes for a lot of flexibility in our model. But it doesn't, what we don't have here, if you look at this, right, we have an effect of the time-varying covariate on the outcome variable across time. So in this model, we're not allowing for the effect of the time-varying covariate on the outcome to vary across time, right? And again, if you sort of look up here, it's like an additive regression model. You don't, right? So we're saying there's some effect of time on the outcome variable, and there's some effect of the time-varying covariate on the outcome variable. But in a model like this, we're assuming that the effect of the time-varying covariate on the outcome variable, even though it might vary across people, it does not vary across time. So, going back to this example of like depression and whether you have a job or not, that would be saying, whether you have a job or not might influence how depressed you are, right? And if we allow it to vary across people, then we're saying, how much being jobless affects depression, that varies across people. But we're saying, like, it doesn't matter whether I'm looking at this, 1 month after, 1 month into the study, or 5 months into the study, or 10 months into the study, or a year into the study, the effect of being jobless on your depression is going to be constant across time. So the time-varying covariate can vary across people, but it's not actually varying across time. Now, this is an important thing. We're talking about the slope is not varying across time. But remember, we have values on this time-varying covariate, right? So let's say this is what our data file looks like. We've got, person 1, and they've got some score on the time variable, let's say 0, 1, 2, 3, and then they've got some score on the time-varying covariate. So, this is varying across time, and again, it could be continuous or it could be dichotomous. But let's say the time-varying covariate is continuous. So it could be that we see that, like, the value on the time-varying covariate varies across time, and the effect of the time-varying covariate on the outcome varies across people, but the effect of the time-varying covariate on the outcome is consistent within person in this model. That makes sense? And again, when we're thinking about these random effects, we're really talking about residuals for the time-varying covariate slope, not the time-varying covariate itself. Sometimes people get really confused by that. They start to see this, they see something that says like time-varying covariate slope, and they start thinking, oh, this is the effect of, right? Like this, the slope is the effect of the time-varying covariate on the outcome variable. But we're not talking about the relationship between the time-varying covariate, right, and other variables really when we think about our tau matrix. So I'll have more to say about that in a minute. So questions about any of this so far? Does that make sense? So very flexible, but there's one place where we don't have flexibility, which is we're not allowing the effect of the time varying covariate to vary as a function of time. Yes. Okay. Exactly. In this model, if that's right. So let's just say our, here we've got time, right? And let's just say the effective time is 2, let's say. Let's say that the effect of the time varying covariate is 3. That's our parameter estimate, right? And so here, as time, another thing is, remember, this works just like a regression model, right? So we have multiple independent variables. So if you think about it, it's right, we're talking about the effect of a variable holding the other variable constant at 0. So the first thing that we're really going to have to get into here is how do we center our time varying covariate? And then the other thing to keep in mind that's really, really, really important here is that now suddenly this effect of time on the outcome variable is the effect of time holding the time varying covariate constant at 0, right? So when you run a model, let's just think about this for a second. Let's say we start off with a model like this. We'll do an example like this. There we go. So let's say I start off here, okay? So this is my initial model. So I just have time in the model, right? And let's say the question is, I'm trying to make something that makes sense. Like, let's say we're looking at reading growth. Oh yeah, we have that reading growth example, right? So let's say we're looking at reading growth across time, and let's say that on average, students grow 5 points per year in terms of their reading growth, which I think was actually pretty close to our example last time, but we didn't have a time varying covariate. Right? So let's say that this is 5, right? So, and time is, 2, 3, and let's say our intercept is 5. Example was last time too. And so what does that mean? That means that, when time is equal to 0, the predicted score, right? The predicted score is 20, right? And then they grow 5 points per year. So after 1 year, the predicted score is 25. After 2 years, the predicted score is 30. And after 3 years, the predicted score is 35, right? Great. Okay, now I need a good time break because we didn't have a time varying covariate in that example. What would be a good time varying covariate for reading? Maybe like the amount of reading instruction you're getting during that time period or something.
Home reading.
Hours.
How much you read at home.
Yeah. How much you're okay. How much you're reading at home.
Eyesight.
Sure. What? Eyesight?
Oh, like if your eyes get worse.
Okay, sure. Okay. Well, let's say our time varying covariate is amount of time you're engaged in reading. I like that. That's good. Okay. So now I've got this time varying covariate, and my time varying covariate is going to be the average amount of time. I mean, it's not average yet. The amount of time that I'm engaged in reading, my time varying covariate, right? So now, when I fit this model, these are going to be, well, first, the intercept is going to be the predicted value when everything else in the model is 0. So that's going to be when time is 0 and when the value on the time varying covariate is 0. So if it were like the number of minutes of reading that you engage in, and you didn't center reading, let's start with like reading is uncentered and it's about the number of, I don't know, minutes or hours, doesn't really matter what the metric is. Let's say the number of hours you engage in reading in a given week. Then now the intercept is going to be like the predicted value at the first time point for somebody who doesn't read, right? And the slope would be the yearly growth slope for somebody who's not reading, right? So for somebody who's like, because again, because we're going to be like when the value of the time varying covariate is 0. And when the value is 0 is for somebody who's not reading. And maybe that makes sense, by the way. There are cases where it might make sense not to center your time varying covariate, right? Maybe that makes sense to you. But what's that going to do then to this? That's not what I wanted to do. And what happened there? That was crazy. Here we go. Okay. I don't know what I did. What's going to happen to this, right? To this value of the time slope? In the original unconditioned model, the time slope was just like the expected growth across your entire sample, right? It wasn't controlling for the amount of time that people were reading. So now in my new example, like once I put in the time varying covariate, now it's going to be what's the expected growth slope for somebody when, again, holding the value of the time varying covariate at 0 across time. So it basically be like, okay, sort of, again, I always like to think of these as like little like thought experiments. Like, okay, imagine there's somebody and they don't read at all for the entire course of your study, right? These however many years. What would their predicted growth slope be? That's what it would mean if reading is like, if you put in the amount of time reading and it's uncentered. Is that going to be the same as what we had before we put in the time varying covariate? Like, will we get the same parameter estimate over here for our beta 1 naught? For our time slope? In the unconditional model, it was just like, across everybody. It's only going to be the same if nobody in your sample is reading, which let's hope that's not the case, right? I mean, if absolutely nobody's reading at any time, well, it's a lousy time varying covariate. But beyond that, like, no, right? There's going to be variability in terms of how much people read. And in the first model, where we didn't have the time varying covariate in the model, this time slope was really just about, like, what's the expected growth, right? What's the expected growth rate? I'm using my sample to come up with what's the expected growth rate. But in the second one, it's what's the expected growth rate for people who aren't reading? Like, what's the expected growth rate for a kid who doesn't read? That's not going to be the same, right? And again, let's assume that the amount of time you read has a positive effect on your reading growth, which, I mean, again, I guess we could look at that empirically, but I think there are some strong priors to suggest that that would be the case. So if reading more actually does have a positive influence on your growth rate, then what do you think would happen to this parameter value for the reading slope once I control for the time varying covariate? It would go down. Yeah, probably go down, right? We don't know how much, but it would go down because right now it's like, okay, holding, like it's holding this constant and it's holding it constant at 0, which is saying like now this is the predicted growth for somebody who doesn't read at all. So I would expect it, again, if there's a relationship there, I'd expect it to go down, a decent amount probably. Okay. So that means we got to think about how to center our time varying covariates. Woo, more centering. So I know, just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water, no siree. And in fact, I think centering is more of a bear for longitudinal models than it is in some ways. It's not so bad. Well, it depends on how far you want to go. Like, we're going to stay in the shallow end with our first example. And if we have time, we'll dive into the deep end with our second example. But you can stay in the shallow end with your homework. So you can feel good about that. Yes. Okay. Yeah, sure. So beta 2 to 0, right? This is going to be the effect of increasing, like the effect of increasing or changing reading hours or reading time on your reading score. and here you don't actually have to say like, I mean, it is at any given time point, but you don't really have to say like holding time constant at 0 or anything, because you're making, remember what I said before is like, you're making the assumption that the effect of the time varying covariate on the outcome variable is actually, it doesn't change across time. We're only getting one estimate for the effect of the time varying covariate on the outcome variable. So you absolutely have to say, like, this is the predicted growth slope for somebody whose score on the time varying covariate is 0. And then you got to think about what does it mean, right, to be 0 at that, like, right? But you don't necessarily have to say, like, this is the effect of the time, well, you don't have to, you should, well, you don't need to, and you probably shouldn't say, this is the effect of the time varying covariate when time is equal to 0, because the effect of the time varying covariate, it's constant across time. So it is the effect of the time varying covariate when time is 0, but it's also the effect of the time varying covariate when time is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because we only have one, you know, where we're saying that there is, that the effect of the time varying covariate, it varies across people, but it's constant across time. So because it's constant across time, you don't need to say like after controlling for time, right? Because basically what you're saying is like at any, let's just say that this is we got 20, we got 5. Let's say the effect of the time varying covariate is 1, right? And so then, you know, we would set, this would mean like for a kid whose score is 1 unit above, however this has been centered, right? So if it's uncentered, this would be for a kid who reads 1 hour a week, we would predict that their reading score at like, you know, at 0, right? Or 1, 2, this is how we get time, right? When time is equal to 0, we would predict that their reading score would be what? It would be 20 plus 5 times 0, so that's 0, plus 1 times, we said they were 1 unit above the mean, right? It would be 1 times 1, which would be 1. So we would say that their predicted score would be like 21 at time 1, or time, you know, wave where we have time coded as 0, right? At the first data collection point. Does that make sense? And then, you know, again, this piece is always going to stay the same. The slope parameter is going to stay the same, but a kid's reading could change. So like this same kid could now be reading 10 hours a week at time 2, let's say, and we're still saying that the parameter here predicts, like, you know, for every unit above 0 you are here, we're predicting that you'll be, you know, 1 times that many units, right? So let's say if at time 2, the kid is reading 10 hours a week instead of 1 hour a week, then their predicted score would be like 20 plus 5 times 1 plus 1 times 10, right? Which would equal 35, right? Which would equal 35. Yeah? Okay. Questions? Does this make sense? Okay. So the effect of the time varying covariate is staying constant across time. And now the time slope is really after controlling for the time varying covariate. And more specifically, it's holding the effect of it's holding the time varying covariate constant at 0. So now let's talk about how we might want to center that time varying covariate then. What do you think? What could we do? Well, we could leave it uncentered if uncentered makes sense. And, you know, it might, I mean, by the way, you can always center categorical variables, dichotomous or categorical variables. There's nothing that says you can't. And in fact, there's a nice article that Yarmish and Hedeker and Preacher wrote about centering categorical variables. But I would say probably one of the most common times that people don't center a time varying covariate is when it is categorical or dichotomous, right? So in our example of have a job or not have a job, you could imagine like, okay, you know, maybe I just want to leave that as like a 0, 1. So 0 means I don't have a job, and 1 means I do have a job, let's say. I think that's how we're going to code it when we do it. So there are times you might want to leave it uncentered, but let's say let's say it's something like, number of hours reading. I don't know. Do you really want your time slope to be the predicted growth for kids who don't read at all? Maybe not. I mean, maybe you do, but maybe you don't. What might be another sensible thing that you might want to do? Yeah, you might want to sort of have it be at the overall average, right? So, I mean, here again, there are sort of two possibilities. We could think about group mean centering, or we could think about grand mean centering, right? And if we grand mean center, then we're saying that this would be, and this is where things, well, and we will come back to some of these ideas later on, but if we grand mean center the time varying covariate, then we're centering it, you sort of think about it, we're centering across all time points and across all people. So going back to my reading example, this would then be, we would center so that it's like across all of the time points in the sample and across all of the kids in the sample, we get the average amount of reading hours. And that would be, that's when we're grand mean centering, right? So, okay, that might make sense. I don't know. It's certainly easier to interpret than the group mean centered version, but you know, we've got this issue of conflation of, you know, within and between level effects. So okay, we can do that. We can grand mean center it. And then it's just when somebody's right now this is the effect of time on the outcome variable, right? Or the yearly growth slope for somebody whose reading score is at the overall average. And the overall average really means both across time and across people. What about if we group mean center? Let's just think about that for a minute. What would it mean to group mean center the time varying covariate? Yeah. That's exactly right. So group mean centering in the longitudinal case really means, and it's often called person mean centering, because you're subtracting the person's average, right? So then basically what you'd have here is you'd have like what, you know, so for each person, you're going to have their own personal average. And so now, you know, we should get something that if we do that, gives us something there, then we're not really, we're not controlling for between person variability in the amount of reading time anymore with the time varying covariate, right? Because anytime you group mean center, you're basically taking that variable and you're breaking it into two pieces. You've got a piece that's like operating at the within level, at level 1. So it's, you know, within cluster, within person. And then you've got the piece that is between cluster, between people. So if I just take like a person's deviation from their own sort of personal mean, and I use that as the time varying covariate, I mean, that's good. I mean, then it gives me an idea about the effect of within person deviations in reading and how that might actually influence people's reading achievement. But I have the same issue that I had when I group mean centered in the organizational case, which is I've lost all of the information about between cluster variability in reading, right? And so I would definitely then need to take the aggregate of that time varying covariate and add it back in as a predictor at level 2. So it follows the same logic of what we were doing in the organizational models when we group mean centered. We're gonna take that group, we're gonna take that variable, and you know, each person has their own person mean, which basically that information kind of gets lost in the group mean centered variable, but we would take that person mean and we would plug that person mean in as a level 2 variable. And let's imagine how we might do that. So we can put, say, the mean for the time varying covariate, right? Oops. There we go. not 1, times the mean for the time varying covariate plus Rj. There we go. So here, what would this be saying? What would this parameter give us? Telling us about how mean differences, right? Or like people's differences across kids in terms of the average amount that they read, right? So this is like each person has a different sort of average reading. So between person differences in time reading predict the intercept, right? Predict what their reading scores are when time is equal to 0. So would I want to, do you think I would want to put that anywhere else? Where else might I want to put that mean variable? A person mean. Yeah, I mean, I probably would want to put it in the slope for time as well, right? Because I would be saying, now I'm saying, so this would be like beta 1, 1. There yet, but. So this is saying now, like, is there an effect of like average amount of reading time on the growth slope? So, because maybe it is, because again, well, maybe it is that people who tend to read more on average, right, across time, maybe they grow more quickly than people who read less on average. That's probably true. There's definitely like a bit of a causality issue there, right? Like which came first, the chicken or the egg? Is it the fact that they're good readers that makes them want to read more? Or is it the fact that, or is it because they read more that they're better readers? I mean, this isn't a causal study. This is a longitudinal descriptive study, but it certainly makes sense that there would be a relationship between how much time people engage in reading and how quickly, again, this would be the reading growth slope, right? Like how quickly they grow in reading. So I guess, do people who read more grow faster? Do people who read more start higher? People who read more grow faster? And then, okay, this is always a fun one. What about this? What's this? I could do this. You don't have to do this necessarily, but I could do this. What's this telling me? It's a cross-level interaction, right? And it's the effect of the person's amount of reading on the within person effect of reading on. I know this is where it gets like a little, but it's again, this is going to make more sense in certain research scenarios than others. There are research scenarios in which you're like, yeah, that's exactly what I want. And there are other research scenarios where you're like, I just don't, this doesn't make sense to me. And that's okay, because that's kind of how life is. But what this is really saying is like, does the average amount a person reads, does that influence how much their deviations from their own like homeostatic reading state, how much their deviations from that overall average affect their reading, their reading score at a given time point? So like conceptually, let's say if it could be the case that for people who on average read a lot more, within person deviations in reading from time to time have less of an influence on their outcome because they're generally reading a lot overall already. You see what I'm saying? And that for people who read very little, those within person deviations from time point to time point actually have a bigger effect on their reading scores. So at first it seems really weird, but if you stop and think about it, it could kind of make sense in some contexts more than others, but it could make sense, right? Yeah? Okay. But again, it gets to be a little bit of there's a bit more of a tongue twistery kind of thing going on here because we've got this time varying covariate. Instead of grand mean centering it, we've group mean centered it. So we really, now this group mean centered piece really is just about, that's really just about the deviation, the within person deviation, right? And if I really want to be, if I want to be controlling for between group differences in the amount of time people read, and B, if I kind of want to look at that between within thing, then I really need to add the aggregate back in. All right. Does that make sense? Yes. Yeah, theoretically, you could just add to one of these equations. You don't necessarily, just like any other, group level or level 2 predictor, you don't have to put the same set of level 2 predictors across all of your, across all of your equations. Personally, I think that, again, you have to remember that the intercept is really just like the predicted value when time is 0. So I think it's pretty common that you might think that, well, it depends. I guess maybe it isn't, but I mean, I can imagine that you would most likely be able to think of reasons why it would make sense to put the, sort of the average value of the time varying covariate in as a predictor of both the reading intercept and the slope. Maybe you think that it's going to influence this effect of the time varying covariate itself or not. Again, I can think of lots of cases where it does make sense. I can think of other cases where I'm like, I don't know if I buy that, but yeah, but you don't have to put it in as a predictor in all 3 equations necessarily. This is where you really have to think about what you're modeling, why you're modeling, how you're modeling, right? Now, one little like caveat that I'm going to mention this week, and then we're going to ignore, but it's very important, and we will come back to it later on. So, like, this is all well and good, but if you think about it, there's nothing in this model that's really allowing for like growth. I mean, I'm allowing the variable, the time varying covariate, I'm allowing that score to vary across time, right? But for the outcome variable, I'm really modeling growth in the outcome variable across time, right? But with the time varying covariate, I don't have a model for growth for the time varying covariate. Like, I've put it in as a predictor, but because I don't have an explicit model for growth of the time varying covariate, I'm really kind of assuming it's sort of like a no growth model for the time varying covariate. So if you have a time varying covariate, let's say you have something like, you want to know if vocabulary growth, you want to know vocabulary, let's say it's reading growth is your outcome variable and vocabulary is your independent variable, right? And so you're looking at how well does vocabulary predict how well does vocabulary predict your outcome, and how well does it predict, so, and how well, right? How, whatever, you got it in there as a time varying covariate. But the point is that, like, you might actually think that vocabulary also grows across time. So kids' vocabularies are getting better as as time goes on, in just the same way that their reading skills are getting better as time goes on. And in some sense, like, because you're allowing the value of the time varying covariate to vary across time, I mean, you're not assuming that value is held constant, but you don't really have an explicit model for growth of that time varying covariate. What might be a better model in such a scenario might be a model where you're actually modeling the growth in vocabulary across time and the growth in reading across time, and then looking at how growth in vocabulary and growth in reading relate to each other, right? But that would actually require having a growth model for the time varying covariate. And there isn't, do you see what I'm saying? There isn't like an explicit growth model here. So I think that's something that kind of gets underplayed. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, the easiest way, by the way, to do something like that is to do it in structural equation modeling. Yeah, because right, because structural equation modeling is multivariate, right? So it's really easy to have two variables and be looking at, have those two variables. I'm measuring them in tandem. I've got a growth model for this variable, a growth model for this variable, and then I can look at how the growth parameters relate to each other, right? I can allow the intercepts to correlate, the slopes to correlate. I could have one predicting. I mean, ultimate flexibility there. So the easiest way to do that would be in a structural equation modeling framework. But there is actually a way that you can, I'll say like trick, there is a way to actually set up your data to run a model like that. Again, probably not as flexible as SEM. There's more flexibility there, but where you can actually have, you can do sort of a simultaneous, it's called a multivariate, multi-level model. So there's sort of a way you can set your data up to sort of, trick this univariate program into actually analyzing your data as multivariate. So again, easier in SEM, but simple multivariate models like that can be done in multi-level. It was something I was definitely planning to show you all how to do. I don't know. That's one of the things we might run out of time to do. So we'll see. But just know that we don't have an explicit growth model for the time varying covariate here. So like that's something you should be thinking about too. Like, am I cool with it? So I'm basically saying there's no systematic growth in the time varying covariate. Like it changes across time, but I'm not modeling systematic growth in the I guess that's what I should say. I'm not modeling systematic growth in the time varying covariate. I'm really just modeling systematic growth in the outcome variable, and I'm using time varying covariate as a predictor of that. And the other reason that I want to mention that, not to go too far down this rabbit hole, but that's also where, if you start to think about, this is where like, when you think about centering, it also becomes a little bit tricky because in a not totally resolvable way. Because let's say that I do think that the value of the time varying covariate does systematically increase across time. So we'll go back to my vocabulary and reading example. If I grand mean center the time varying covariate, then grand mean centering the time varying covariate, like if you think about what the intercept is, let's just think about how do I interpret the intercept? The intercept is reading achievement at the first time point, right, at the start of the study, when the value on the time varying covariate is at the overall mean. Not the overall mean at age 6, not the overall mean at the start of the study, the overall mean across, because remember what I said, grand mean centering is like across all time points and across all people. So it would be like, what's the predicted reading score for a kid at age 6 who reads as much as an average kid across all the time points, or whose vocabulary, say whichever one we're using, or whose vocabulary is as good as like an average kid, but that's averaging across people and across time. So let's say we've got scores at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Let's say that the grand mean average might be something very comparable to like the average vocabulary score for an 8-year-old, because that's like the middle of the age range, right? So it'd be like, what's the predicted value? What's the predicted reading score for a kid at age 6 whose vocabulary is like an average 8-year-old? Oh, well, that's not exactly what I wanted, right? I mean, in some sense, as long as I know that's what I've got, that's good, right? And I can deal with that in terms of my predicted values, because I can figure out, well, how much below that grand mean would a 6-year-old kid be? And then I could, when I do my predicted values, come up with a predicted value for an average 6-year-old, like a 6-year-old who's at the average for vocabulary for a 6-year-old. But what I'm getting as a parameter estimate, right, is for the intercept really is the average reading score for a kid whose vocabulary is at the overall mean across both time and across, people. So you might think, well, like, okay, then I should group mean center and I should add the average back in. But see, group mean centering and adding the average back in, although it's good in terms of partitioning within and between variance, it doesn't actually solve that problem, because you still have the problem that the group mean centered variable, again, imagine that that variable is growing across time. It's still when that person is at their average. So like if if I'm getting better across time, my own personal, like, and I've got scores at age 6, 8, and 10, let's say, my own personal average is going to be much more like where I am at age 8 than it is like where I am at age 6, right? So now when you think about the group mean centered variable, I still have this issue that it's not really giving me, like when I look at my parameter estimates, I'm not really getting a parameter estimate that's like, oh, what's the predicted score for a 6-year-old, right? Whose value on the time varying covariate is at the average for a 6-year-old. So you might think to yourself, like, maybe that's what I should do. Like, let's just, you could do that. You could say, I'm going to center this score. I'm going to center it for the average on the time varying covariate at age 6. And that actually would work really well for the intercept. But where does it get a little weird? It kind of gets weird when you get off the intercept, right? You get to other time points, because now you've got, like, again, you're controlling for growth. So this is like the growth rate for a kid whose score is like that of an average 6-year-old. But again, I've got time across 6, 8, 10. So that seems like I don't really like that either, right? That doesn't seem great. So this is probably, in my mind, one of the main reasons that if you really do have a time varying covariate that is systematically increasing or systematically decreasing across time, it is important to A, think about how you best want to model that, and B, even if you decide to stay in a univariate multi-level framework, you really need to think about then how to interpret the effects of that time varying covariate. And again, that's sort of regardless of your centering. And you have to be very cognizant of that. And that seems like a little weird, but it is what it is. Okay. Questions about any of that? Centering is so much fun. So the first example that we do today, again, like, if you've read the Hoffman papers, and if you've read Hoffman's book, as I have, and if you read the Rights and Sturba stuff, they will caution you against ever grand mean centering anything. This is an interesting controversy, actually, in the multi-level literature, because I would say there are people who are like just rabidly always group mean center, and then there are people who are like, group mean centering stuff is weird, and would actually generally prefer to grand mean center things. And then I would say I'm somewhere in the middle, where I think I can totally see the advantages of group mean centering. But I do think for some of the, well, if we get to the second example, we will get to the second example. If we get to the, I grand mean and group mean centered, the second example, I think you'll see that it's just a lot easier to, like, the parameter, thinking about what the parameters mean for you, like at your stage of the game, I think you're going to find is a lot easier with the grand mean centered model than the group mean centered model. It's just a lot. Well, you can see there are a lot more moving pieces, right? So we'll talk about both grand mean and group mean centering. But again, the first example we're going to do, we're just going to grand mean center that variable, and then the second example, I'll show you both. And for your homework, you're just going to grand mean center the variable to make it like a little bit more manageable. And back to the thing that I still haven't talked about that I wanted to talk some more about, which is, okay, remember I said that we're making this assumption that the effect of the time varying covariate on the outcome variable is constant across time. I'm not allowing for this effect of the time varying covariate to vary across time. But maybe I want to, like, maybe I think that the effect of becoming like getting a job on your depression, maybe I think that would have a bigger effect like earlier on, and that the effect would diminish later on, or maybe I think it would have a bigger effect later on, right? But I might really legitimately think that the effect of the time varying covariate could vary as a function of time. So how am I going to do that? Because that's important. I mean, we do want to be able to fit models where the effect of the time varying covariate can vary as a function of time. Yeah, exactly. We could add an interaction. We could add an interaction between varying covariates. All right, so now we're going to add pi 3 sub I. And how do we do that? Well, we're just going to multiply the time varying covariate by time, right? Ti. Okay. So now we have to think about centering from the perspective of we've got an interaction term too, right? So we're generally going to be fine. I mean, I generally don't do anything new to center time when I'm doing this. So remember, I usually often have time centered at initial status. And so we've got time as like a 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Fine. I mean, I think that's fine. But the time varying covariate does need to be centered, right? And so let's assume now, let's go with the easier case where I've grand mean centered the time varying covariate, right? So now I've got, this is now the effect, right? This is now the multiplicative term is really giving me the interaction between time and the time varying covariate. So if, let's say, well, how do we interpret this actually is going to depend in large part on the other parameters. Are my other slopes positive? Are they negative? Let's just start with, let's say that this slope is positive and this slope is positive. So I've got, right, as time, again, well, you got to think about what all this means now. Remember, this is now the effective time on my outcome variable when the time varying covariate is, or sorry, when the effect of the time varying covariate is at 0 at the overall mean, right? And also like, well, no, let me start here. Let's start with the intercept. The intercept is the predicted value when time is equal to 0, right? And when the time varying covariate is equal to 0. So if I grand mean center this, then I'm saying this is the predicted value at time 1 when the time varying covariate is at the overall mean, right? Now, if I think about what this time slope is giving me, it's the time slope is still, I still have this effect of the time, like I still have the time varying covariate in here is in there, but now I also have this interaction between the time varying covariate and time. So what I'm really saying, come on in, what I'm really saying is that the effective time, or the effect of the time varying covariate varies by time, right? Or conversely, you could say the effective time varies as a function of the time varying covariate. So now I really, just like in regular regression, I can't really interpret the main effects without thinking about the interaction effect. I really need to think about how to interpret the interaction effect and what that means in terms of my main effects, right? So for example, let's say our time varying covariate, let's go to our employment status one, because that's kind of easy. Actually, let's not grand mean center it. Let's make it easier. Make it our employment example. So the time varying covariate is 1 is employed and 0 is unemployed. Okay. So now the intercept is the predicted score at time 0. So at the start of the study, for somebody who is unemployed, right? And the time variable, the parameter for my time slope is now what? The predicted growth for whom? We've got a moderation, we've got interaction, so we've got moderation. That's why I said this is easier than thinking about the grand mean centering to start out with. It's the growth slope for whom? It's not just the growth slope anymore, because we've got a time by time varying covariate interaction, right? So when does this when is this whole thing 0? Yeah, obviously when time is 0 or when the time varying covariate is 0, but if I'm going up in time, it must be when the time varying covariate is 0, right? So now this growth slope is really telling me about, it's the growth slope for people who are unemployed, right? So now this thing is actually going to be the predicted slope for those who are unemployed. Not the predicted growth slope overall, but the predicted slope for those who are unemployed. What would be the predicted growth slope for people who are employed? Well, pi 2 is the effect of being employed when time is equal to 0. Right? So this is telling you how much does getting a job decrease or let's say how much does getting a job decrease my depression if I get a job at time is equal to 0? So this is the effect of the time varying covariate when time is equal to 0, because, right, I need this thing to fall out of the model to be able to interpret this. Like, and this, you know what I'm saying? Like this. So this is the effect of the time varying covariate at time is 0. This is the effect of time when the time varying covariate is 0. Didn't know interaction yet. You're going to know it after this class. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I guess technically it's going to be like beta 1 plus beta, but same idea. That's fine. So it's like going to be our beta 1 naught plus beta 3 naught is actually going to be the growth slope for the employee. Right? Like, or like that, you know what I'm saying? And actually, so, well, when we map, maybe I won't go any further than that right now, but what we're going to see is that we can actually kind of map this out. And you can sort of imagining it something like this. So let's say this is the slope, assuming that the TVC is equal to 0, right? And then you might get something like this. Let's say that's the slope when the TVC is equal to 1, right? And again, this might be like my beta 1, and this is like my beta 1 plus my beta 3. But really what I'm saying, because it is a time varying covariate, is that a person could actually, like, imagine these as being like sort of two like potential outcome slopes, almost like two imaginary slopes that a person could find themselves on. And so like I'm here, and I mean, again, these are predicted values, right? These are like prototypical, like stylized person. Stylized person is floating along here, doesn't have a job, doesn't have a job, doesn't have a job, gets a job, and they basically that's the time varying covariate is going to be that drop. And do you see how here, when I say that the effect of the time varying covariate, how much of a drop it is, it varies as a function of time? You can see that because like if I went la 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 and then I got a job, see this change is not the same as this change, is not the same as this change, right? That's the idea that the effect of the time varying covariate functions as, varies as a function of where I am on this trajectory. You see what I mean? So that's the interaction. But you can sort of imagine a person goes la 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 la, they get a job, they drop down here, la 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 la, they lose their job. Theoretically, again, this is very stylized, right? But like they're going to jump up here, la 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 la, they get a job, they jump down there, la la la. That's kind of what we're saying. So like this is the beta 1, right? This is the beta 1 plus the beta 3. But because the value of the time varying covariate actually does vary across time, we're not actually saying that somebody has to be constantly unemployed or constantly employed. They can actually be sort of jumping back and forth across these trajectories. Yeah? Cool, right? Yeah, so basically, because beta 1, so here's my beta 3. And again, we have the time varying covariate times time. And, so first you have to sort of think about what this looks like. At time is equal to 0, it's going to be 0. What's it going to look like? Like now I'm talking about what this looks like in the data. I'm not talking about the parameter estimate. I'm talking about like, here is my column in the data. So it's 0 at when time is 0. What is it when time is 1? TDC. Exactly. What is it when time is 2? 2 times, that's right? Because it's literally time 2 times TDC. What is it when time is 3? 3 times TDC. So now when you think about it like that, then you can see that, like, again, if the time varying covariate is 0, okay, so I should have said that. This is for somebody who's a 1, right? So this is what it's going to be if TDC is equal to 1, right? If TDC is equal to 0, so let's say this is person 1. What's it going to be for person 2? Where TDC is equal to 0. So they never get a job. What's this interaction term going to be in their column? 0, 0, 0, 0, right? And so now when you think about it that way, then you can see how it makes sense that over here, then, okay, this whole thing, this pi 3i, right? This doesn't come into play for a person who's a 0 on the time varying. But again, now a person doesn't have to be all zeros. Like I just made them all, but they could be switching back and forth, as I said. But like, it doesn't come into play when the person is 0. So then what's their growth slope? Well, their growth slope is just the beta 1, right? But if you look at how this is additive, it's like 0 times TDC, 1 times TDC, 2 times TDC, right? And here our time varying covariate is literally, right? So, so here, if you are a 1 on the time varying covariate, see how this is basically, right? We're like, we've got time is going up, 0, 1, 2, 3. And so if you're a 1 on the time varying covariate, then it's really pi 3. It's going to be like, and I guess I should have said this is a 1. It's going to be 1 times time. So it's going to be, 1 times 1, 1 times 2, 1 times 3. So like, if you think about it, that's like almost like a second additive time slope, right? It's like, oh, for a person who's a 1 on the time varying covariate, I'm going to take this value, this pi 3, whatever the beta 3 naught is, and it's going to be multiplied by time times, again, times the time varying covariate, which in this case is going to be 1. And so it's like a second, it's almost like it's not really like a second slope in the same way that we're going to talk about second slopes when we talk about discontinuity, but it is actually creating, it is this beta 1 plus beta 3 is really going to give me the predicted sort of change across time for somebody whose time varying covariate is 1. That makes sense? And again, you have to be so careful then when you're interpreting your parameters, because the intercept, the slope, the intercept is not just when time is 0, but it's also when the time varying covariate is 0, right? And the slope is not just the growth slope overall, but it's really for somebody whose time varying covariate is 0, right? And then if we want to know what the predicted growth slope is for somebody whose time varying covariate is 1, then we have to be thinking about this interaction term too. Yes.
Like the way I'm thinking about it is this interaction change in slope with every 1 year. That right?
Change in the growth. Okay, I think that's for a second. The change in the growth slope for every 1 unit change in TDC.
So going from 0 to 1 would be going from unemployed to employed.
Yeah. So going from 0 to 1 is going to go from unemployed to employed here, right? So in this case, yeah. So it's going to be really easy to kind of see how this is really just going to end up being sort of an additive thing. But I think in general, what you want to think about is that this is really, it is the interaction. It is this interaction between time and the time varying covariate. So it is, how does the effective time, how does the growth slope change as a function of the time varying covariate, right? And how does the time varying covariate change as a function of change in time? And I guess I'm just being really careful because I'm going to show you some ways that we can model discontinuity where we literally have like multiple growth slopes. And this is going to be different from that because, again, I think you see it when you look at the predicted values, how it's a little bit different. But yeah, it's really talking about how is the time slope different depending on what your value is on the time variant covariate. That's exactly right. Sure. Yes.
I feel like we probably covered this and probably covered it last semester, but for whatever reason, I'm conceptualizing how we interpret dichotomous variable as predictor because we're not talking about changing, right? It's like we're not like.
Well, it's a 1 unit change in the dichotomous predictor just means you go, I mean, dichotomous is easy. You can almost think of it as like off and on, right?
That's what I mean. So when you're interpreting it, you're putting it in a static way since you wouldn't say it's going to increase like it so many times.
Well, it's only going to increase. I mean, you are right that like a 1 unit increase is your maximum increase, but it's still interpreted in the same way is that like as X changes by 1 unit, right? Y changes by this many units. But you're right that it's not, X can't change by 30 units because it's dichotomous or whatever. But
as an outcome, like I remember.
Yeah.
But just as a predictor, I guess.
Yeah, as a predictor, it's really easy. It's just going to be like, so for a 1 unit change in X, you expect this much of a change in Y. So, but the 1 unit change is basically as you go from, exactly. As you go from male to female, or as you go from control to treatment or whatever. So yeah, you're not going to, it's going to be easier in some sense because you're only ever going to have a 1 unit change with the dichotomous variable. Well, I shouldn't say that. I mean, sometimes people code things weirdly. Like, what if you effect coded something that's -1 and 1? What if you effect coded so that male is -1 and female is 1? People do that all the time, right? Then going from male to female is not a 1 unit change. It's a 2 unit change. People mess that up a lot, actually. Well, they do it because, okay, there's a good reason. They do it because then the average is 0. So the intercept is like the average. But I still think it's stupid because there's a much easier solution, which is make it -1/2 and +1/2. So it's still a 1 unit change and you still get the average of 0. So I don't know why people do -1 and +1. I think
Swami drilled it into us that it was half and then -1/2.
Yeah, I mean, it's much better, but I do see people do -1 and +1. And like, I would not recommend you do it, but if somebody else does it, you have to be very conscious then of understanding that parameter estimate is like, actually like it's a 1 unit, that's basically a 1 unit change, which is like from male to halfway to female, like whatever, right? Like, I don't know, it's weird. So you shouldn't do that, but just be aware of how other people are coding their variables, right? Okay, this is enough of this one slide. Let's do some data. Ready? Yeah. Okay, so now, oh wait, I didn't, maybe I should say something about this. Let's go to the second slide first. Then we'll do some data. I forgot. We have a whole other slide. All right. So here we go. Now we've got our combined, this is our combined model on the top, which here we don't actually have an interaction. Oh, by the way, you could actually, that interaction term, so any of the effect of the time varying covariate can randomly vary across people, as we talked about. So technically, the effect of the interaction term could also randomly vary across people. Like again, now that's a little bit of like a brain tease. So going back to our example, that would be saying, we're saying, oh, the effect of being employed varies across time, right? And the effect of being employed varies across people, and the effect of time varies across people. And now I'd be saying the interaction between the effect of time and the time varying covariate also varies across people, theoretically, right? So that how much of a, again, we were saying that the effect of the time varying covariate varies by time, and now we'd be saying, oh, how much the effect of the time varying covariate varies across time could in itself vary across people. So that's theoretically possible, but again, I think you would want to really think through whether you have a legit reason to do that, right? And that you can interpret it correctly. So for right now, we don't even have an interaction here right now. Just talking about like a time varying covariate, and here's our tau matrix. If we're allowing that time varying covariate, if we're allowing that effect to vary across people, then now we've added an additional variance, right? So we've got the between person variance in the intercept, got the between person variance in the growth slope, and we've got the between person variance in the time varying covariate slope. So again, this is really the effect of the time varying covariate on the outcome, right? And this is the growth slope. Again, holding the TVC constant at 0. So it's like after, so really, again, because these are residuals, these are residual terms now. Well, I mean, they always are, but this is, so this is like, and this is also the intercept, you know, holding the TVC constant at 0. So I would expect that, you know, the time varying covariate might actually help to explain some of the some of the between person variance in the intercept and some of the between person variance in the growth slope, right? So now tau naught naught is really about the residual between person variance in the intercept, holding time varying covariate constant at 0. Tau 11 is the between person variance in the growth slope, holding the time varying covariate constant at 0. And the time varying covariate slope is really the effect of the time varying covariate on the outcome. And again, I don't have to say controlling for time because, as I said, in this case, right, we don't have an interaction, so we're assuming the effect is the same across time. So that's what those variances mean. Now let's think about these covariances. Ready? Okay, we're used to this guy. So what's this? Like the covariance between the intercept slope, but again, holding the time varying covariate constant at 0. So after controlling for the time varying covariate or holding the time varying covariate at 0, what's the correlation between the slope and the intercept? If we're looking at the correlation number, right? And again, that's not necessarily going to be the same thing as the correlation between the slope and the intercept from the unconditional model. Because now we're controlling for this time varying covariate, which we're assuming also helps to predict where people start and how fast they change, right? I mean, it's at level 1, but it's probably related to our outcome variable. It's related to our outcome variable, or we wouldn't have been putting it in. Okay. How about this? Tau 2 naught. So this is the correlation between the intercept and this is where people sometimes get confused. It's the correlation between the intercept and the time varying covariate slope. So it's basically the correlate again, so the correlation between the intercept holding the time varying covariate constant at 0 and the effect of the time varying covariate on the outcome variable. So sometimes people get they see this and they're like, oh, it's about the time varying covariate. And they say, oh, this is the correlation between the intercept and the time varying covariate, like the variable itself. It's not the correlation between the intercept and the time varying covariate. It's the correlation between the intercept and the slope of the time varying covariate, which is the effect of the time varying covariate on the outcome variable. Yeah. So this is correlation of the covariance standardized between the intercept and the time varying covariate at 0 and the time varying covariate slope, which again is the effect of the time varying covariate on the outcome. And finally, tau 21 equal to the covariance between the slope, the time varying covariate at 0, and time varying covariate slope, which again is the effect of the time varying covariate on the outcome. And once again, sometimes some of these terms will be more salient than other terms. There are times where you're like, oh yeah, I really think that there's like, I know exactly, I'm interested in that. I know how to interpret it. And there are other times where you might be like, that wasn't even anything I was thinking about, right? But it's important to know how to interpret all of these parameters. Which one? Yeah, the covariance between this one, the covariance between the slope, and again, holding the value of the time varying covariate at 0, holding that constant, and the effect of the time varying covariate on the outcome variable. Or another way to say that is and the time varying covariate slope, right? The slope of the time varying covariate is the slope of the time varying covariate on the outcome variable. So you can think of that as, you can think of this as the correlation between the time slope holding TDC constant at 0 and the time varying covariate slope. But that's just shorthand for saying the effect of the time varying covariate on the outcome. That's what the time varying covariate slope is. So you could say it either way. Yeah? Okay, I can't believe we're almost halfway done with class. So we
Yeah, I
should
was
take a
just gonna
break
say,
now.
yeah.
Let's take our break now. And then during the break, everybody download and pull up the unemployment example. That's both in the it's up online and it's also in the courses folder. So we'll take a 10-minute break, but during that 10-minute break, make sure you download the file, get the folder on your computer so that when we come back, we can start doing the example. Okay.
No.
Well, it's okay. It's good for people to understand. Yes.
Real quick. The question is, I'm having like the same thing in my head with life. I never got grades below A.
Oh, okay. Well,
Ever.
ever.
And then
Bad.
like 77.
Yeah. So I saw that you had some troubles with the predicted values lab, right? So I was going to talk to people about that.
Yeah, and they don't understand what they did wrong. Because like in some other exercises, people said like, please you were wrong, but they don't know what they did wrong. So they don't know what they should do correct.
Yeah. So for the predicted values one, my recommendation would be, well, I don't know exactly what you did wrong either, because I haven't
Yes.
looked exactly at what you did, but you obviously did the same thing wrong. Like that's what happens with these predicted values. If you do it wrong once, that problem sort of, so, oh wait, hold on.
Exercise that
that on? All right. Copy. All right. All right, ready? I think, so we talked a lot conceptually before the break, and I hope it kind of made sense, but I also think that as we go through this example, with any luck, it will make things a little bit more concrete too. So this is, and actually it's kind of nice, we've kind of been talking around this example for a while. So this is the unemployment example, and I'm just going to sort of talk through what's going on here. So we've got, I forget how many people, a couple hundred people, I think, 200-300 people. And they're, as I said, they sort of are invited to be part of the study when they show up in the, it's not my data, by the way, data that is in a textbook from many, many moons ago, but I like the data, so I use it. So I might have the story slightly wrong, but it's the story we're going with. It doesn't really matter. My understanding is, I just want to be clear that, like, don't ask me too many, tricky questions about exactly how they were consented or anything like that, because but my understanding is that they were asked to be part of the study, like when they show up in the unemployment office. But then, of course, like by the time they're in the study, it's, at least a couple weeks later. So if you actually, so unemployed or employed is actually this level 1 variable. It does vary within person, but again, it doesn't vary within person for everybody. So some people are constantly unemployed. Some people are constantly employed, which again would seem weird when it's an unemployment study of unemployed people. That's why I mentioned that, like, there was some lag time between the time they consented and the time they started. So some people are always employed, some people are always unemployed, some people are unemployed and then they become reemployed. And theoretically, a person could be unemployed, get reemployed, and then become unemployed again. I don't think there are a ton of cases like that, but I think there are at least a few. And you could go through the data file and look at that. And of course, if it is your data, you do want to go through the data file and look at all of that. And again, I want to mention that as I mentioned earlier, you can't really estimate, you can't estimate a slope for anyone where there isn't a change in their status, right? I mean, if you think about it, like, it doesn't make sense, right? There's this within person slope, and if there's no change, there's no slope. And so, last week I talked about the idea that, sometimes things might look like time varying covariates, and maybe you should treat them as, time invariant covariates, right? In this case, I mean, if you think about it, what we're doing, well, hold on. So we're going to put this in as a time varying covariate, but we're not necessarily going to allow the effect of the time varying covariate to vary across time. And so if you think about that, that is in some sense a lot like putting it in as a time invariant covariate, right? Because now pi is equal to beta. So anyway, but I'm still choosing to think of it as a time varying covariate. I mean, I'm still thinking of it as this level 1 variable, especially because we're going to interact it then with time. So anyway, okay. And we could play around with that too. We could try to allow the random effect. We could try to fit the random effect, but as I recall, it doesn't work great. So anyway, okay. So the first thing that we're going to do actually is we're going to load in the data. So go ahead and run the libraries if you haven't already. And then this is actually oh, did I stop sharing my screen? I'm sorry. Yes, online folks, thank you. I did hit record again.
And also Betsy, that data file is a .av.
I know.
So how,
We've got a different, yeah, I got it.
okay, because somebody is having,
No, use the code that I've got. We're using the Haven package.
so in the R markdown.
Yeah, in our markdown. Yeah. Should work. Okay, so hold on. Share. Screen. Okay, so now, wait, where's my mark? We're somewhere. I think I have too many things open. Okay, there it is. All right. So, yeah. So this is actually an SPSS file, but that's not a big deal. We can read an SPSS file into R. So here I'm actually using the Haven package. I'm gonna just like comment out the question mark read underscore save. The question mark read underscore save will open up the help menu if you want to see how to use that, but we don't really need that. But we do need to read data file in, and it should be, oops. See this? Yeah, so you can see we've got this data file. Look at it, which is always a good idea. Here we go. So we've got an ID variable. We've got the months. Months is the months. That's our time variable. It's the months since they became unemployed. You can see it's time unstructured data, right? It's kind of crazy looking with all those decimals. Depressed is their depression score. I think it's on the CBSD depression scale, if I remember correctly. Unemp is the unemployment, like, are you unemployed at the time? And you can see, for example, that like person 103 is unemployed the whole time. And then there's another variable called employed, which is actually the like reverse, right? And so it's, are you employed at the time? So you can see that like person 103 was not employed. Employed is 0 across all their 3 time points. So unemployed is 1 across all their 3 time points. We are obviously not going to use both of those variables in the same model because they're completely collinear, right? Do you see that? So employed is 0, unemployed is 1. This is unemployed by time interaction. So if you look at like months times unemployed, that's what that is. This is the employed by time interaction. So we've got basically the employment variable coded in 2 different ways. One where employed is 1 and right? One where employed, and I always do that with dummy coded variables. I name it whatever the 1 is. So employed means employed is 1 and unemployed is 0. And unemp means unemployed is 1 and employed is 0. Why might you want to, what logical reason might there be for using unemployed or employed? Why would you choose one of these 2 variables over the other? Obviously, they're going to be like mathematically, statistically equivalent, but like what variable do you think we should use in our model? Should we use the unemployed variable or the employed variable? Why?
Expect depression to increase because you're interested in depression.
Oh,
Like,
okay. I mean,
versus if you're interested in depression decreasing because it's like,
I mean, hypothetically, I guess, maybe. I don't know. That wasn't the reason I was thinking of. There's a much more basic reason.
no idea what you're thinking.
Okay. Who can read my mind? Anybody? Yes? Intercept. Yes, intercept. What about the intercept? Intercept. Yes. Intercept is the right answer, but why? What? Yeah, we want why? So why? Which one would I choose then, and why? It's all about the intercept. You're right.
Oh, because of it.
Like remember, the intercept is when everything is 0.
The
0 months.
0 value wouldn't tell you anything.
Well, 0. Okay, so think about this. The intercept is when everything is 0, right? So it's when time is 0 and time is centered. Basically, at the moment, like time is centered when I show up at the job office, okay? Right? So time starts ticking then when I show up at the unemployment office and it keeps ticking. So it's like my depression score, predicted depression score when I show up at the unemployment office And what I want, when this time varying covariate is 0. So would I want to be predicting that for somebody who's unemployed or for somebody who's employed? Unemployed, right? Like it would be really weird to have the intercept be the predicted depression score of somebody at the moment in which they are unemployed, assuming that they are employed, right? Like that. And in fact, I think the original, if I remember correctly, the original book that I got this out of actually had it. That's why it's in here 2 different ways. They actually had it that way. And I was like, that makes no sense, right? I want to code it the other way because I want my intercept to be the predicted score for an unemployed person, assuming they're unemployed, not the predicted score when you become unemployed, assuming you're like doesn't even. So that's why we're definitely going to use employed variable instead of the unemployed variable. Again, like you could, there are reasons that it might be useful to have it both ways. I think later on, I think I show how you could get the simple slope for employed, like having the coding the other way, but we're generally going to use employed. 0 means you're unemployed and 1 means you're employed, right? So if I want the intercept to be when everything in the model is 0, I want it to be when employed is 0, which means you're unemployed. Pretty with me? Okay. So that's that. I meant to take this one out. Don't worry about this level 2D. That was like in HLM, you always have to have a level 2 variable. And so I just made up a dummy variable, but it's literally all 1. So we're not going to use that. Okay. So now I can go back to, here we go, week 8. Here we go. Okay. I mean, I have just a couple notes about things you can do. You know, you can use like Glimpse to look at the structure of your data if you want. If you're bringing something in from SPSS and you want to see what labels are attached, you can do that. I'm going to kind of skip some of this stuff. It's not actually salient to what we're doing now. I will go ahead and create this. We're not going to use this, but I could create, even though employment is a dichotomous variable, I could actually create a variable that's like the person mean of employment. So what would that give me, by the way? So employment is like 0. It's employed is 1, unemployed is 0. So if I create a person mean variable for the employment variable, what's the range of the variable going to be, and what is it? What's it going to look like? What's the lowest score it could be? 0. What's the highest score it could be? 1. Right. And then what's it really going to be giving me? The proportion of waves at which this person was employed, right? So you could theoretically, I mean, we're not going to actually use that as a level 2 predictor, I don't think, but I could do that. And then I am going to create factor variable. I'm going to create factor variables for employment and unemployment. Again, this is one of those cases, like this is one of those things where like in R, sometimes it's helpful to have numeric variables for certain things. Sometimes it's helpful to have factor variables for certain things. So I'm creating factor variables. I'll go ahead and do that. We've already talked about this data, so I'm not going to do the describe again, would show you some of what the looks like. Oh, and I don't really need to do this, but I'll run it anyway. I'm now grand mean centering that variable, that employed mean centered variable. Okay, but let's get to the actual stuff we're going to do here. So if I run this, there we go. This is actually, I think we only have like 3 data points for each person here. So we're only going to be estimating linear models. If I remember correctly, or most people only have 3, I think. Anyway, that's what people's scores look like. It's kind of a mess, right? I don't know. Looks like some people are going down, some people are going up. It's really hard to see. So again, here's some code that will help you to run little growth. Yeah, people only have 3. And you can see some people, like this guy only has 1. So not everybody in the sample 3 is the max. And obviously, so remember, any person that only has one data point, we can't estimate any slopes for them. We can't estimate slopes for people who are constantly employed or unemployed. For the employment slope, not necessarily for the growth slope. And I think I've coded this so that you can see one is red here and blue is 0. So if you're, so like this person is constantly unemployed, right? Unemployed. I don't think we have any constantly employed, but like here's somebody who is unemployed at the first time point, and then they became then they got a job, and they didn't, right? So again, I can't stress enough when it's your own data how important it is to really look at your data, understand your data, get a sense of your data. So again, looking at this, you can see there's a lot of variability. I mean, I don't know that I can tell what I expect to see for the time varying covariate here. It's too small a sample, but like there's definitely a lot of variability in terms of intercepts and slopes, right? I don't know. Again, if you can see the story of the time varying covariate in those data, good for you. I don't quite see it myself. Well, that's not true, actually. We're not getting rid of any data. It's not like we're deleting any data. That's one of the beautiful things about multi-level modeling, actually. We're using maximum likelihood, and we can use all of the data that we have. So if somebody only has one data point, they can't really contribute any information about the time varying covariate, like the parameter for the time varying covariate slope, or the parameter for the time slope, right? Because we can't estimate, but they could contribute information about the intercept, right? And so one of the nice things about using, I mean, it's true for SEM or HLM, using either of these approaches for longitudinal modeling, we never have to delete people. But some people give us a lot more information than other people do, right? So think about it that way. Okay. Yes. Okay. Great. Sounds good. No, this is not all of them. There is some code. I can't remember if it's in this example or the other example. There is some code remember when I put include equals false, it won't run when I render the markdown, but I leave some things in sometimes just because I want them for myself, or you might be interested. And so I think it's in the other example, I have something with include equals false, where I actually run this for everybody in the sample. But what you'll see is that, as you can expect, what ends up happening is the boxes get really small as you have more and more people. So if you could, what I did in the code actually, and there probably are better ways to do this, but I basically said, okay, I'm going to create a reduced data file by filtering unemployment, and I'm going to take everybody whose ID is less than or equal to 3546. How did I know that? I looked at my data. And I said, I want about 40 people. I sorted by ID, and I said, okay, that's the ID number. Now, that is not a random sample of people, right? You could also randomly. There are lots of other ways you can. This is what I did. Then you could also do this, I've done this before, where I do it multiple times. So I say, I'm going to do it, I create one reduced data file for the first 40 people, another reduced data file for the next 40 people. And I basically run the same code for everybody, but I don't run it all at once, because if I run it all at once, I get these teeny tiny little boxes, but I'll actually run it for every person in of 40 or 42. So that's what I did. So when it's your own data, you probably want to look at everybody, but if you try to look at them all together, it'll just be a mess. Unless you have a small number of cases. But then that's bad for other. Okay. Let's see here. Good visual, right? Okay, here we go. So it scares me. Okay. But it does look really pretty, right? So the first model that we're going to run, and I would recommend, I generally think it's a good idea to just run, even though I know I want to look at time varying covariates, I think it's really helpful to get on the board by just running the unconditional growth model. So we're going to start by running the unconditional linear growth model. So basically here we've got depression is predicted by the intercept and the growth slope. And when you do your homework, even though we have a model of time varying covariates, the very first model that we ask you to run, I think, is an unconditional model. So, all right. So here we go. Right. So we've got depression is predicted by the intercept. And oh, darn it. Happens sometimes when you don't put enough spaces after. These are supposed to be two lines. You can see that, right? Yeah. I was trying to go through and make sure, and you don't really notice it till you render, but you have to have at least two spaces afterward and then a hard return. And if you don't have at least two spaces in a hard return, it just puts it all on one line. So I apologize for that. It's really annoying. Okay. Anyway, so how we're going to run that, you all know that, right? Easy. We've got, I'm calling it model 1. Elmer, depression is a function of months. That's my time variable plus, and here I just put 1. I don't have to have the 1 there, but I'm just reminding myself I have a randomly varying intercept, randomly varying time variable. ID is my ID variable. Here again, I'm using FIML so that we can do model comparisons for models that differ in their fit easily. And I'm going to run that. Where did my output go? Where did my output go? What is the output? It's really weird.
Source.
Back to source. Do I? I thought I could run it in the visual, but I'll go back to source. Let's see. Here we go. Yeah, I guess I need to go back to source. I never use the visual mode. I just think it's prettier for the equations, but now I know why I don't use it. Okay, here we go. So let's take a look at our output here. Okay, so let's quickly interpret the intercept and the slope. So what is this telling me? Intercept is 17.67. What does that mean? This is easy. It's an unconditional growth model, right? So, well, yeah, beta not in this case. That's okay. But yes, but how do I interpret it in this model? It is the expected depression score when time is 0, right? So like right when people become unemployed, their expected depression score is 17.67. And their slope is, and this, I like this example for this reason too, their slope is negative 0.42. So we haven't seen a negative slope yet. What does that mean? Yeah, depression's decreasing by 0.42 points per month. Over the course of the study, people's average depression, right, or their depression scores are decreasing by 0.42 points per month. Okay, so that's easy. Good. Keep that in mind. It's good to know. But again, that's not taking into account whether people, oh, and we didn't look at our TAUs. Let's look at our TAUs here. Okay, here we go. Yeah. Times negative. Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit more right now. It's times negative. So that means that their predicted score at time 0 is 17.67, and they're growing at a rate of negative 0.42 points per month, which really means they're declining by 0.42 points per month, right? So if you think about what that looks like, but if you think about what that looks like, they're starting here and then they're sort of eventually declining by 0.42 points per month, right? So now let's look at our tau matrix. Here's our tau matrix. And you can see that there's a lot of between person. I mean, a lot. I should probably not interpret the magnitudes without thinking about it a little bit more, but there's between person variance in the intercept, right? Tau not is 87. So the standard deviation is 9.3. And I could do those. Remember how we talked about those plausible values? So I could say like, oh, I would expect, what did I just say? It was 17.67 points. And I would expect 68% of people to be somewhere between 17.67 plus 9.3 and 17.67 minus 9.3, right? So yeah, now that I thought about it, I can legit say it seems like there's a lot of between person variance in the intercept, right? And now the slope, the between person variance in the slope is 0.355, and that looks really small, but remember the slope, the slope was only what, 0.4, it was negative 0.4 points. So if you think about the standard deviation for that, then we're saying like, okay, so it looks like, yeah, the slope is about negative 0.42. Some people's slopes look like they're, right, sort of do that plausible value. Some people's slopes are more negative than that. Some people's slopes are actually slightly positive, right? Because again, negative 0.42 plus 0.6 would give me what? Positive 0.22 or something like that, right? Positive 0.18, something like that. Okay, great. Now, I don't know if this is fair to interpret yet or not. Remember we talked about, is it fair to interpret the covariance parameter? We got to think about that. But before we even do that, let's talk about what it means to have a negative covariance between the slope and the intercept if I have a negative slope, right? So if I have a positive slope, well, let's think about all the possibilities here, right? If I have, and I don't get it right. Yeah, I want to draw this on the board. This is in the R markdown files too. I have pictures of this. But like, think about, let's start with a positive slope. If I have a positive slope, and I have a positive correlation between the slope and the intercept, right? Or let's just think about a positive correlation between the slope and the intercept, regardless. Positive correlation between the slope and the intercept means the higher the intercept is, the more positive the slope is, right? The higher the intercept, the more positive the slope. But if I have a positive slope and a positive correlation between the slope and the intercept, then what do I get? I get something like, if you look on page 6 of your markdown file, you're going to see a really pretty picture. Probably more pretty than,
Probably better than I'm gonna draw.
and I guess I can probably run it here.
But just kind of draw out.
Yeah, go ahead and draw it out. That's nice. Here we go. So positive slope, intercept covariance. Ta-da! There it is. I can pull it up on the board, right?
Oh, God.
So you can see, like, this is just an example where, like, the intercept is higher, so the slope is more, and the slope is more positive. Don't think of it as the slope being steeper. That's the important thing. Think of it as the slope being more positive, because we're about to go into the scenario where slopes are negative, right? So in this case, right, and no matter what, a positive correlation between the slope and the intercept means that that if the slope is, if the intercept is higher, the slope will be more positive. And what that gives you actually is a fan-shaped pattern, like that. Everybody with me? It's not obvious. We've seen these examples before. Now, okay, next one is, and again, we've done these. So positive slope, negative correlation between the slope and the intercept. With the negative correlation between the slope and the intercept, you're going to get like a pincher pattern. You're going to get like a fan pattern with a positive correlation. You're going to get a pincher pattern with a negative correlation. Here, what this is saying is that as the intercept becomes more positive, the slope becomes more negative, right? But the slope was positive in this case. So you can see that the slope is flatter here than it was here, right? So more positive intercept, less positive or more negative, the more negative slope is really the way to think about it. But in this case, because the slope was positive, it is a less positive slope. Everybody with me? So that's positive positive slope, positive correlation between the slope and the intercept. All right, so now, here we go. Here's a negative correlation. Negative correlation, but we actually have, negative slope. Negative slope, but we have a positive correlation between the slope and the intercept. So again, the negative slope you can see that the slope is decreasing in both of these pictures. But the positive correlation between the slope and the intercept means that the higher the intercept, the more positive the slope. Right? But in this case, because the slopes are negative, more positive means less negative. Are you with me? So like this has a higher intercept, so the slope is more positive than it was. But because it started out as being negative, it's actually, because more positive in this case just means less negative. So it looks flatter here, but it's really that it's more positive. So, I mean, again, it means, if you really think about it at a deep level, it means the same thing, but for some reason, people get really tripped up by negative slopes and then thinking about the correlation between the slope and the intercept. And then finally, we have our last one here. There we go. So here we go. Here we've got, again, it's that pincher pattern that you get with it. So we've got negative slope, negative correlation between the slope and intercept. And that negative correlation means that the higher the intercept is, the higher the intercept, the more negative the slope is. And so that's what you see here is that, people who are higher are decreasing faster than people who are lower. So that's a negative slope, negative correlation between. Again, if you sort of look across these four, you'll see that, in both the positive and negative case, you get a fan-shaped pattern when you have a positive correlation between the intercept and slope. And in both cases, you get kind of this pincher pattern when you have a negative correlation between the slope and the intercept. But again, it's really negative correlation between the slope and the intercept saying, oh, I have a negative slope, and it's getting even more negative for people who start higher. Okay, so now that we've gone through that, I forget. Did we have a negative correlation between? Yes, we did, right? We did. So this is our situation. We had a negative slope and a negative correlation between the slope and the intercept. So that's saying that in general, people's depression scores are going down across time. They're going down faster for people who start out with higher depression scores. That kind of makes sense, right? And again, the question is like, as we've talked about before, is that a fair sort of covariance to interpret? What?
But we're just laughing about pictures.
All right. So anyway, but let's move on and let's do our time varying. Now we're going to do our model that has a time varying covariance. Put it employed. Again, it's dichotomous. 0 means unemployed and 1 means employed. And I'm not going to actually put a random effect in for the employed variable here. So what does this look like? Okay, here's what it looks like in R, right? I've got depression is a function of employed. Don't have an interaction yet. Once an employed and same random effect structure because I'm not adding random effect for employed here. So let's run this. Oh, and I did a fancy output here, right? So pretty. Okay. So now let's make sure that we can this, and then we'll go to the interaction. Okay. So intercept is 17.77. So what does that mean? It's the predicted value for somebody who just lost, right? For somebody study like when they walk in the unemployment office or whatever. Assuming what? Yeah, assuming that they're unemployed, right? So when employment is 0. So their predicted value is 17.78. And now, the months thing has changed a lot. Wasn't it negative 0.4 or something? Something. Now it's negative 0.2. And how do I interpret this month slope? I don't interpret it the same way anymore, right? I mean, it's still a monthly growth slope, but what? Holding employment status constant at 0. exactly. So this is actually, this is like the monthly, this is like a monthly, well, it's like a monthly growth slope. Again, holding employment status constant at 0. So it's really the monthly growth slope, right, after controlling for employment status or constant at 0. And what about this employed variable, or not variable, parameter estimate, negative 5.11. That's the effect of employment status on depression. So what does that look like? So I'm starting out at 17.78, right? And I'm going down by 0.2 points per month as long as I'm unemployed. And then let's say I get a job. What happens? I predict a drop of like 5.11 points. So can you draw like two parallel lines on so that's kind of what this is saying. Like this model, my first model was just one line sort of, right? It's just like, boom, going down by 0.4 points per month. But now you can sort of imagine that I've got sort of two parallel lines, again, because I'm not allowing for an interaction effect between time and the time-varying covariate. So I'm really saying, like, whether or not I'm employed, I'm starting, actually, for unemployed people, I'm starting at like 17.78. I'm going down by 0.2 points per month. And then for employed people, that trajectory is basically 5.11 points lower. So just another parallel line that's like 5 points higher or lower.
Yeah.
Just make it parallel, right? And so you can sort of imagine that, like, I'm starting out here as going to be my unemployed, right? So I'm dropping when I get employed, kind of like the employee slope, and this difference in here, negative 5.11 points, let's say. And the slope in both cases, though, is equal to negative. So like both groups are right there down, but like when I get my job, imagine like I'm here, I'm starting at 17.78, I'm going down, I get a job and whoop, whoop, whoop. Now I come down to this trajectory, go, oh, I lost my job. Oh no, she goes back up. Job. Right? Got to follow the logic of my prototypical person. Yeah. But those slopes are parallel because I don't have an interaction between time and the time-varying covariate. Yeah. Okay. And so the effect of the time-varying covariate on my depression, if you think about what I'm saying there, the effect of the time-varying covariate on my depression, it's the same across time. See that like gap the jump I was making is the same across time. Yeah. Okay. Now we're ready for an interaction. Ready for an interaction? No? I'm ready for an interaction. It's going to be so exciting. Okay, here we go. There are covariates parameters. We're not going to worry about that. Okay. Now, here I actually, so here actually should do this. Let's do this just to my model 2. We already looked at model 2. But I might want to remember how I said, like, is it fair to interpret that? We didn't look at hold on, it's up here. Tau not 1. It was negative 0.55 or something, our correlation, but now our correlation is negative 0.59. Time varying covariate. So this correlation between the slope and the intercept is now the correlation between sort of starting depression and depression growth, which is negative, again, sort of negative growth after controlling for employment status or holding employment status constant at 0, right? So we're basically saying for the unemployed, there's a correlation, there's a correlation of negative 0.59 between where they start and how fast, actually in this case, how fast they decline or their negative growth, which again, remember, means what we're saying is that for unemployed people, the higher their depression is at the start, the faster they're dropping. But before I interpret that, yeah. Because the slope, remember, so this is just, everything we do is just really like fancy multiple regression. So our regression model, think about our level 1 model, it's saying that the outcome variable is a function of, right, the intercept, the time slope, and the right, the effective time, we've got time variable in there, we've got the employment variable in there, and the intercept is always the predicted value when all the other predictors are 0. Right? And the time slope is the predicted time slope. I mean, if you think about it, the time slope is also holding constant unemployment status. And that might seem weird, but we also have this effect for unemployment. So like in the first model, the unconditional linear growth model, we hadn't put unemployment in it at all. Right? So we just had like, there's this effect, and we saw that the slope really changed. It was like negative 0.4, now it's negative 0.2. But that was across everybody. Like, what's the predicted like effective time across everybody? But some of those people are getting jobs, having jobs, some of those people aren't. Right? But once I put in once I put in that unemployment slope, I'm allowing for employment status to help to explain how people are different in terms of their depression. And because I'm putting it in there to allow it to help to explain how people are different in terms of their depression, then that's why now my time slope is really a time slope after controlling for employment status. Yeah.
So
Controlling for, but I mean technically, yeah. After controlling for really does mean holding constant, and even more technically, holding constant where? Holding constant at 0. But yeah, but if you want to think of it as after controlling for in this case, I think that's fine. So what we're really saying is before I control for employment status, I predict that the time that depression goes down by about 0.4 points per month. But once I actually allow for the fact that, so, once I put employment status into the model and allow for the fact that some people are employed and some people are unemployed, I see that actually whether or not they're employed seems to actually be a pretty big predictor of their depression. And once I put that in the model and just for that, then I see that actually the time slope is much less negative than it was, right? We've gone from, it's like half the size that it was. Does that make sense? You with me? And now the question is it fair to interpret that negative covariance? I want to, and I want to be able to say like, oh, yeah, again, holding, right after controlling for employment status or holding employment status constant, that, people who start higher in terms of depression, they seem to drop faster. There seems to be a negative relationship between the slope and the intercept. But in order to do that, I really would like to know that that is statistically significant, right? I'd like to be able to say that's interpretable. Remember, I showed you an example where it was like the correlation was 1 and it wasn't actually, the deviance didn't change at all. So remember the logic that we've used here is we can actually like compare a model that has the covariance in to a model that doesn't. You could use test bar, but nobody seemed to like that. So I think here I'm just doing it the old, doesn't matter. You don't have to. Here I'm doing it the, right? If it doesn't work for you, whatever. Here I'm doing it the old fashioned way. So the old fashioned way is I'm fitting a new model 2 that's model 2. I'm calling it model 2 no code because it's going to be model 2. And the only thing that's different is that I'm not allowing for covariance between the slope and the intercept, right? And I'm going to fit that model. And remember, I just do that with the little double bars there. Nice little trick. Okay, and then I can run the ANOVA. Okay. Go. Oh yeah, here it is. So if you look at the ANOVA here, you can see that actually the chi-square difference between these two models is 9.4 points, and it's only 1 parameter difference because the only thing that's different is that in model 2 no covariance, one fewer parameter because we're constraining, what we're really doing is constraining that covariance to be 0. That's the way you should kind of think about it. We've simplified the model by constraining that covariance to be 0. And when we constrain that covariance to be 0, how much worse does my model fit get? Well, it actually gets quite a bit worse, right? If you look at it, the deviance goes from 5107.6 to 5117. So it's almost, it's almost 9.5 points difference. That would be statistically significant. And actually, here's the p-value. And if you look at like the AIC, and remember with AIC and BIC, there's no like magic magnitude. It's just lower is better. And you can see the AIC and BIC here both favor model 2 over model 2 with no covariance. So again, like, I wouldn't want to go out on a limb and be like, well, it's exactly negative 0.59, because, again, these things are not measured with a ton of precision, but it's totally fair to say that the covariance is negative, that it does seem like there is this tendency that, again, there is this tendency that people who start higher tend to drop faster. That's a fair, I can say that now because I know that at least that's statistically significant. Okay, so now I'm going to run over. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for AIC, I could totally say like the deviance needs to go down by at least 2 for the AIC to be better, right? For the more parameterized model, and in this case, it's only one parameter, it goes down by 9.4. So I know the AIC is going to be better. The BIC is tougher because I don't know what the square root, I don't know what the natural log of n is, right? So there, I'm probably going to want to look at the BIC. I think it is the same per parameter penalty. I just don't know what the natural log of my sample size is in this particular case. So that's kind of useful. But you're right.
You're interpreting it.
Well, the two things go hand in hand. The way the AIC is computed is with the penalty parameter. So I know, like, they're one and the same. Like, if it drops by at least 2 points, then the AIC will be lower. Like, if it drops by more than 2 points, the AIC will be lower because that is the penalty is 2 per parameter. Yeah, I mean, I don't have to do any subtraction here because, again, with AIC and BIC, the general rule is you just look and lower is better because the penalty is already built into the formula. And so you don't have to do any of that math yourself. You can just look at the AIC and BIC. Like, if it doesn't drop by at least 2, that's when the AIC won't be lower. See what I'm saying? So we talked about that penalty parameter because I was explaining how it works, but it's built into it. You don't have to do it. I was just for you to understand it. But I'm glad you internalized it. That's good. Oh yeah.
It was like really active, like, but it didn't actually pay for the complex, so it's at 2. Didn't like I expected, like, oh, is lower, like the penalty was this at 2, but it didn't.
So you're saying like the chi-square dropped by 2. If the chi-square dropped,
The IAC was like, it's still not.
yeah. Well, it should be the case that if the deviance drops by 2, it should be that the AIC should be the same across the 2 models, right? Yeah, exactly. So, and then of course, right. Then you, and this is the problem too, is that different things will tell you different. Well, but if that happens, then the likelihood ratio test is going to be non-significant and the BIC is going to be non-significant. So in that case, I would say you're going to probably go with this. You would want to go with the simpler model, right? You had a question, yeah.
So like multiple parameters,
Mhm.
difference between the 2 models. So would you do the difference of the AAC by 3, see if it's dropping by?
Well, no, because again, the per parameter penalty is built into the AIC. So if it's a 3 parameter difference, then the AIC is basically penalizing 2 per parameter. It's like it's going to be the deviance plus 2 times 3.
Okay.
So it's built in there already. So you're just going to look for the lower AIC is what you're looking
Okay,
for.
so
So
no
you,
matter the difference in the parameters.
no,
Got
you
it.
just lower AIC or lower BIC is better. I mean, having said that though, I mean, again, I think reasonable people should think like, gee, if the AIC is 0.00000001 points lower, like, is that convincing evidence? Like, yeah, probably not, right? But then again, if you find that, you're going to find the likelihood ratio is not significant. The AIC is not going to be lower. These are all, I mean, they're all based on math, but they're still all heuristics, right? Like people made this stuff up. It's not like they're infallible, especially when you have three different ways to, you know, what's that saying? Like, if I have one clock, I know what time it is. If I have two clocks, I never know what time it is. It's like, I feel like the AIC, the BIC, and the likelihood ratio, it's like, I've got three clocks. So now I don't know, right? So at a certain point, you just have to like, you know, you really have to look at this evidence and kind of weigh it and say, what makes sense? How compelling is it? You know, you should definitely be thinking about these things in terms of sample size as well, because the deviance is, this is true for SEM, and this is true for multi-level. Deviance, chi-square are a function of sample size, right? And so if you have a ginormous sample, the deviance is going to be bigger. And then I mean, you're thinking, well, it's the difference in deviance I'm looking at. That's true, but you know, everything scales up. And so even the difference in deviance is bigger. So like, if I have 1 million people in my sample and the AIC is 1 point lower in one model than another, I'm not going to be necessarily as convinced as if I, you know what I mean? So you got to think about all this stuff. But anyway, I digress. Now let's look at RENOVA for a second. Remember RENOVA, we run the RENOVA here. It is, I'm just saying RENOVA model 2, and remember the way that this works is it basically is just going to delete, it sort of compares model 2, my original model, to a model in which I take out the random slope for months. Now this is a 2DF test instead of a 1DF. That's not the test I wanted to see if I needed the covariance, right? I've already said I need the covariance. I'm running this though because I want you to look at something. What do you notice when you look at this 2DF test? So I took out, remember when I took out the covariance for the slope and the intercept, the deviance dropped by how much? Go back up there. There. 9.42 points, basically, okay? The deviance dropped by 9.42 points when I took out the covariance. Now I've taken out the covariance and the variance for the slope. How much did the deviance drop with those two parameters? 9.48 points. But I know that the deviance dropped by 9.42 points when I took out the covariance. So what does that mean about if I were to, again, if I were to compare the model that had the covariance out, but the tau 1 in, to a model that had the tau 1 and the covariance out, what do you think the difference in the deviance of those two models would be? I mean, you could figure it out. This is like basic math, right? I mean, like it's going to be what, like 0.06 or something, right? Because it drops by 9.48 when I take out two parameters. It dropped by 9.42 when I took out one parameter. The only difference between those two is the other parameter. So it's only dropping by another 0.06 when I take out the slope variance. Now you might say to yourself, well, maybe I should get rid of the slope variance. But I can't do that, can I? Because if I take out the slope variance, I will automatically lose the covariance. And you can't have a covariance between a slope that doesn't have variance, right? Like if you take the slope, right? So if that's an all or nothing. But it is kind of interesting to note here that like, and actually when you do the 2DF test, it is still statistically significant, suggesting that the model that has both the variance and the covariance is better than the model that has neither. But it is kind of interesting. I'm just pointing out this particular scenario. The reason it's better seems to be really a function of the covariance that is really kind of driving the boat, not the variance. See what I mean? So just a kind of like an interesting thing. But again, doesn't mean I should take out the variance because that would be worse. And we see that. Okay. And then I got a test var thing. I could do that. I'm not going to do the test var. You got the idea. This is just doing the same thing over again. Okay. I want to make sure though. Okay, we still have half hour. Okay. Okay. So growth model now with the time varying covariate and an interaction between time and the time varying covariate. Yay! So let's see. Visual thing go. Go back to visual here for a second. Scares me. I don't know why it scares me so much to do this. Okay. It does though. But it looks prettier. Okay. So here we go. Here we go. Look, here it is. So just to remind ourselves of what our model, and let's look at our combined model. The combined model looks better, right? So now we've got depression, function of, we've got this intercept, we've got beta 1 naught times the month slope, plus beta 2 naught times the employment slope, plus beta 3 naught times the interaction between months and employed. And then we have our randomly varying intercept, our randomly varying month slope, and our within person residual, right? Our within person residual. And again, we're going to fit an unstructured tau matrix. So we are also going to be estimating that covariance between the slope and the intercept. Okay. So the code here is really simple. I mean, I can just say months times employed here, because remember when you do that, when you create that interaction term, it automatically puts in the lower order terms as well. So you could do it either way. You could write months plus employed plus months times employed, or you could just write months times employed. It does not matter. I know I kind of vacillate back and forth in the code, but either way is going to give you the same thing. And by the way, if you're ever unsure, like the surefire way to know if it's working is just look at your output, right? We run this, look at your output, you got main effects, you're good. If you ever do something and you don't have the parameters you thought you were going to have, then obviously you're not good, but it works. It totally works. Okay. Oh, wait, no, I got to go back. Oh, yeah, I guess we are. I don't know if that was totally intentional. I thought I'd gone through and made it simple for everybody, but okay. So we may go back and change that again. Hold on. But right now we can run it in REML just to look at our parameter estimates. It's really, if we want to compare models that differ in their fixed effects, we're going to want to do them. Well, maybe we'll put REML equals false in here. Why not? Right? Although again, I mean, just to remind yourselves, I need this to be capitalized. Just to remind you though, if you use the ANOVA function, it redoes it. Comma, there we go. Just to remind you though, if you do use the ANOVA function, it should re-estimate using THIML, so that you'll get when you're comparing models that differ in terms of their fixed. Okay, so let's run model 3, and I think most importantly, we want to make sure that we can interpret model 3 parameters. Okay, here we go. So let's make sure that we can interpret our fixed effect parameters here. So let's think about this for a minute. Our intercept is 18.15, right? And so this is what? Predicted depression score for somebody who's unemployed at the start of the study, right? Or, yeah. And then our months is negative 0.303, and our employed is negative 8.53. So remember before we had like negative 5.11, but we were sort of saying that like we really were assuming that the effect of getting employed was going to be constant across time. But here we've got this months times employed interaction, which is 4.65. So let's just think about how this kind of plays out, right? It plays out, if you sort of think about it, we've got, if you're, let's think about somebody who's unemployed across time at first, right? That's probably like the easiest thing. So if you're unemployed across time, you're going to start out with a score of 18.15, right? And then your score is going to drop -0.303 points for every month that you remain, that you remain in the study, right? Again, assuming you're unemployed the whole time. So let me see, I need to draw this. Can I erase some of this stuff?
Yep, the eraser's on the podium, or on top of
On the
it.
podium, okay. All right. Sorry. Okay. Here's what we've got. I'm sorry to the people who are online, but. So here's what I've got. Depression. Okay. And I'm starting off, let's say this is my 18 whatever, and I'm going down by -0.3 points per month, right? That's those who are unemployed. Now, I think the easiest thing to do is let's imagine another slope. Let's imagine somebody who's always employed, right? So if you're always employed, what's that going to look like? Well, let's come back to our parameter estimates here for a second. So when time is equal to 0, months by employed is going to be equal to what? 0, right? So that is not going to come into play at the very outset, that interaction term. They're employed though. So you can think of this employed as kind of being like the effect on depression right when time equals 0, which in other words, it's kind of like the effect on the intercept, right? The effect on depression when time is equal to 0. So what does that mean? That means that I'm going to get a drop here of -8 point, what was it? 8.5. 8, okay, -8.5 points. So while this was like 18.1 or something, this is going to be what, like 9 point something, right? Something like that, right? Close enough. Okay, we'll make them red. So they're going to start here at 9.6, right? And now imagine we're going to trace their trajectory across time. And the trajectory, if you're like, this month is the monthly growth slope for unemployed. The monthly growth slope for employed is what? Remember what we said? For the break, we said it's going to be this plus this, right? So it's going to be, let's call this -0.3 and +0.47. By the way, that explains why I was going through this and I was like, I had 0.47 instead of 0.46 because I had done it in Fibble and somehow I forgot to put Fibble. Like, how did that change? That's why. Okay. So anyway, so we've got -0.3 plus +0.47 gives me what for the growth slope for the employed? 0.17. So the growth slope for the employed is actually going to look like this. Right? It can be like plus 0.17 points per month, whereas we've had -0.13 points per month, right? And so now, again, if you sort of imagine these as like your two sort of, your two, whatever I'm going to call them, like counterfactual growth slopes, kind of, although I'm probably like culturally appropriating from causal inference slopes. Maybe that's not fair. Anyway, but like this shows you what I mean by this, the effect of employment varies by time, because remember how I did that silly thing with the parallel lines? So here's my person. I'm unemployed. If I get a job right away, I drop by 8 points in terms of depression. But let's say I'm unemployed and I'm unemployed for a little while. And like, think about this too, by the way. I'm unemployed. At first it sucks. But as time goes on, it sucks a little less. Right? And I'm employed. At first I'm like, yay! But as time goes on, it sucks a little more. Right? You're like, jobs are not up to me.
I'm missing my day.
That's right. Being unemployed wasn't all bad. I'm being facetious.
Like 5 weeks.
Yeah. The next question would be, is this statistically significantly different from 0, which we will ask and answer. But for now, let me play along and say they're getting more. Anyway, so the point is that like the slopes are different. How do I know the slopes are different? I've got a statistical test for that, right? I've got a statistical test for whether the slope for unemployed people is different from zero, and the answer is yes, it is. Negative 0.3 is statistically significantly different from zero. And I've got to test for whether the differential between employed and unemployed, right, that months by employed interaction that's also statistically significant, right? I don't actually have up there a statistical test for whether the 0.17, like I have the test of the differential between the two, but I don't have the test of whether the employed slope is different from zero. But again, that's where having the dummy code both ways and rerunning it can come in really handy, right? Because I could just do that and find out whether this is significant. Okay, but for right now, here I am, I'm unemployed. If I get reemployed right away, I drop by 8.5 points. If it takes me, 10 months to get reemployed, let's say, in 10 months, because I'm dropping by 0.3 points per month, in 10 months, I would have dropped by about 3 points. So 10 months in, I'm at like a 15.1, right? And then you can figure out in 10 months in, I was at a 9.6, but now I'm going to be 1.7 points higher than that. So what is that? That's like 10 months. 10 months. So 1.7 plus 9.6 is what? 11.3 or something? Call it that if it's wrong-ish, right? So now the drop here, though, 10 months in, it was going to be an 8.5 point drop if I got reemployed right away. But now that I'm 10 months in, the drop is more like 4 points, let's say, right? You should check my computational arithmetic here, but you get the idea that like the longer I go along, the smaller this gap becomes, right? When I switch from being unemployed to employed. And so that's really what this interaction is saying. It's saying the effective time, well, first it's saying, so again, this visualizes what we're saying when we think about interactions. It's saying the effective time on depression varies by employment status. I can see that because the slopes are different. And it's also saying the effective employment status, the effective employment status on depression varies as a function of time. I can see that. That's how the gap is changing. So this visualizes exactly what an interaction is. And this interaction tells us why we can't just, interpret the main effects in isolation, why we really have to think of everything as a package deal. And my advice to you, both in regular regression and in multi-level regression, at any time you come across an interaction, is the best way to understand an interaction is to graph it, right? Because then once you graph it, it's like, okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Focus on and just do like a maybe.
Oh, so you're saying like, could you just run two separate models? Run a model on employed and then run another model on unemployed? I mean, I wouldn't. Well, first, it would be very hard to do that because remember, employment status varies within person. Yeah, I mean, this isn't if it were a between person variable, that would be a lot more easy to do, but this is literally, we've got people who are, who are unemployed and then employed. So really, it really wouldn't work very well. Yeah, exactly. So I think I do that somewhere. I don't know if we'll have time to look at that, but I do actually do that. Let's see. Well, we can look at it at least on paper. Where do I do it? Page. Oh, I call it test of simple slopes on page 12. So I say, you might want to know, right? Oh, and here I actually changed from 0.47 to 0.46. So sorry. But anyway, you might want to know, like, is that 0.17 points per month? Is it statistically significantly different from zero? And so I called that model 3. Okay. So if we go to model 3B, blah, blah, blah. So model 3B. Let's just, again, for what we're looking at. Let's run that model, and here we go. So if you look at this model, you'll see these models are statistically equivalent. They have the same deviance, right? And the intercept, but things look really different, right? Intercept is really different. Why is the intercept different? Intercept 4 now. Yeah, this is the intercept at time 0 for people who have a job, right? And so that is that 9.6 that we actually worked out up there, right? And now the month slope is that 0.16 or 0.17, whatever it is, right? 0.16 points per month that we had already worked out over there, but this is now the monthly change for those who are employed, right? And then we see here months by unemployed, and it's the same magnitude, but it's a different direction, which makes sense, right? So we had positive 0.47, we had like a negative, right? But now we have a negative 0.47, but that's because, again, we take that negative 0.47, subtract it from our positive 0.17, we get our negative 0.30. So like these models are actually mathematically equivalent. I think the one I fit first conceptually makes more sense because they should all be unemployed at the start, but they are mathematically equivalent. I can get the predicted values, either way. But the nice thing about this is what I get here is the only thing I really wanted you to look at is the p-value for the month's slope. So now if the question is, does depression, like for those who are employed, is the monthly growth slope statistically significantly different from 0? Is that 0.17? Is that different from 0? The answer is no. The negative 0.30 is statistically significantly different from 0, but the 0.17 is not. So that's kind of the purpose of running this model. Does that make sense? And other than that, I don't really too much care about anything else. Yeah. But the slope is 0.17. Sure it is here, but it's the slope for different people. Right? That's okay. By the way, remember a slope, that just means on average, and this is another important point, because we've got fixed effects and we've got random effects. So you could have a fixed effect that's not statistically significantly different from 0. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should totally get rid of it, because it could be that on average across everybody, it's not different from 0, but there could still be a lot of between person variability in terms of that slope. So like this is saying on average, like for people who are employed, the slope is 0.17 points per month, and it's not statistically significantly different from 0. But the question is, like, again, what about how much between person variability is there in that slope? And we could look at, for that, well, we've got the standard deviation, so that's okay, right? You can see that the standard deviation for that slope, which is not different from 0, is 0.67. So there is between person variability in that slope.
Right, like that just goes back to that first homework where we had you do all those slopes, right?
Yeah. So, and I think it's important to remember too, that, yeah, exactly. Like, the fixed effect coefficients are always like on average across the entire group. And if you were doing something in a regression, because you wouldn't have these random effects, you might be like, well, if on average it's not significant, why do I need it? But you can absolutely have a case here where on average something is 0, right? Like imagine like on average there is no growth, but some people are really growing quite quickly in a positive direction and other people are growing quite quickly in a negative direction. If you have some people growing really fast in a positive direction and other people growing really fast in a negative direction, and you take the average of that, it gives you 0. And like, again, in multi-level modeling, like I want to be talking about these individual trajectories and how they vary. So just because something is 0 on average doesn't necessarily mean that it's not still interesting. If something is 0 on average and there's no between person variability in those slopes, then it's not interesting, right? If it's like it's 0 on average and people don't vary from each other, that's like it's 0 on average and it's 0 for everybody, basically. That's not very good. But it's important to kind of remember those are telling you different things. All right. Oh, so where are we? We did that. Oh, I have an interaction figure here. Ta-da! There it is. That's actually based on our parameter estimate, so it looks just like what we drew. And again, you can sort of imagine unemployed, this is employed, And people could be, because it's not a time invariant covariate, people are literally, you can imagine sort of jumping, yeah, prototypical sort of stylized people are jumping back and forth between those two trajectories because it's a time varying covariate. All right. And oh yeah, so now let's think about predicted values, right? So maybe I want to run some, use the effects package to run some predicted values. So here, the first thing is like, oh, okay, well, if I want to run predicted values, I kind of need to know how many months out I should go, because I don't want to like come up with predicted values for like 3 years if the study only goes for a year, right? That wouldn't make sense. So I just ran this, I ran like some descriptives, and here's a histogram, and you can see that even though it's time unstructured data, when you look at this histogram, you kind of get a sense they were probably going for something, right? They were trying to get people kind of like early on, right after they became unemployed. Looks like they were probably trying to get people about 5 months out. They're probably trying to get people about a year out, maybe, right? Like that, but again, it's time unstructured data, so you have some variability there. But when I create some predicted values, probably want to maybe think out like 12 months or something. Not much more than that, because I'd be extrapolating outside the range of my data. Okay. So, so here so with the effects package, sometimes I have found it to be easier to have like your variables like employed as factors to kind of get what I want. So here I just reran model 2 with employed as a factor variable versus a covariate. So there's nothing is going to be different here. I'm just rerunning that with employed so I can get as a factor variable. You could have run it as a factor variable. Okay, so now let's look at this. Model 2, remember, doesn't have the interaction. So I can get predicted values without the interaction between months and employment. So here I'm just saying the model 2 predicted values are going to be the effect of 2 independent variables. I have months and employed. I'm telling it which model I'm using, which is model 2F. And then here I need to tell it what levels I want to get predicted values for. So this is why I ran that histogram. I was like, okay, well, what months do I want to use? I know employed I want to be 0 and 1, but I decided I would go months. Let's just do 0, 3, 6, 9, 12 months for my predicted values. And then I can run that, and voila! Isn't this nice? Here are my predicted, and then I can also graph this, right? So here are my predicted values. So you can see here's my predicted value at 0, 17.78 here, right? And then employed at that time. Oh, well, actually, that's why. And then here we go, right? Here is the predicted values at 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, at 12. And you can see that this gap stays the same, right? These look parallel. If I were to graph them, and do I have a graph of them? I can't remember if I graphed them or not. But they would be, did I at the end? They would be parallel because I don't have the interaction. So now let's look at the interaction, because that's the more interesting case. So I'm just rerunning my model with employed as a factor variable, and I'm going to basically use the same code here. I still want to look at months and employed, but I'm using model 3F that actually has the interaction term in it now instead of model 2F. I'm using the same X levels of months, 0, 3, 6, 9, 12, and employed 0, 1. And I can run this. Go, and this is much more like what we were looking at up there, because we were looking at the interaction term. So here we go. I get predicted values of like right at the outset, you're in 18.1 if you're not employed. We predict you to be a 9.61 if you are employed, And then, right, and then we sort of can go on at 3 months, this is what we're predicting, 6 months, 9 months, and at 12 months out, we would predict somebody unemployed at 12 months out, we're predicting has a depression score of 14.5, and it's an 11.5 12 months out if they're employed, right? So this is unemployed and employed, and you can see that difference now, 12 months out, is only about 3 points, even though this difference at first was it 8.5 points. And I can now really nicely, it's really easy actually to plot this. Yeah, let me show you, because I have some fancy afterward, but like the easiest way to plot it is just to say plot. Once you get those predicted values, then it'll just give you sort of side by side plots like that. Plot for unemployed, the plot for employed, and you can see confidence intervals. But now if I want to get a little fancier, I can. Okay. If I want to get a little fancier here, I can say this is probably the most important command that say one line equals true, and then it'll plot multiple lines on the same graph. And then I can give some for like axes, I can give colors. This LWD is about line width. I want confidence intervals. I aim for my graph. So you don't have to get all that fancy if you don't want, but I wanted, if you just put multi-line in and you don't put anything else, it doesn't look as nice as even the other graph. So you can try that out if you want to try it. Where'd you go? Oh, I ran the wrong thing, right? Here we go. Here it is. How pretty that is. So there, this is my graph. And it's nice because I can also see like, so you can see by the end, there's kind of, right? Whether or not you're employed, your depression is kind of coming to some endpoint. Yes. Oh, maybe. I mean, that's a good question. Could it be regression to the mean? It could be. Yeah, so I don't know. That's a good question. I think we have to, this is for my data, and I were going to try to publish on this. I would think a lot more seriously about that. But yeah, I mean, maybe. Okay, other questions? Yeah. Oh, I know, and you don't ask me how to get rid of them because I don't know the answer to that. I do know what they are, but I don't know how. I think that it seems to give these little mixed packages, seems to give little tick marks for where everybody is on X. So those actually represent like where people actually, which is actually not I mean, you might not want it for like your publication, but it's actually not a bad thing because it does also help you to realize when you're like extrapolating outside the range of your data or where your data really sit. So like, you can see we're not extrapolating outside the range of our data here, but like really where I have information about what people's scores are right in here, right in here, and right in here. And then I am assuming linearity, right? So I am sort of extrapolating linearly in between those. Yeah. Well, no, I mean, if you really want to extrapolate out that far, they would cross and they keep going, right? Yeah. So, yeah, no, I wouldn't do that. All right, well, hey, actually end on time today. Did I get bonus points for that? All right, so let's stop here. I do think we're probably going to need an extra week for for longitudinal. So I'll give you an update sometime between now and next week about what sad thing we're going to get to cover. But
You say it's important to study longitudinal over time.
yes, I think it's very important to study longitudinal over time, and I very much appreciate the longitudinal humor too. All right, so I'll see you all next week. You should have everything that you need to do this homework, I hope. Yes.